Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for joining. I know Andreas and Thomas from DocuTeam had some questions about their current setup. They're migrating from Fedora 3 to Fedora 6, and they had some concerns or wanted to discuss a little bit about the bloating, I guess we'll call it, of the OCFL repository or the OCFL component. So I'm just going to hand it off to Andreas and let him run you through what they've got.
Yeah, thanks for arranging the call. I think it's really important for us to be able to show quickly what the situation is and get some feedback. We're having some ideas what we could do, but basically I'm really interested in hearing, and then I think it's really great to have so many people joining to learn how others have been dealing with this kind of situation. So let me share my screen. That's probably
Dan, you might have to give. Oh, here we go.
No, it's okay.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
I think good. Yeah. Okay. So we're moving also finally from Fedora 3 repositories to Fedora 6. We're not using the migration tools. We're coming more from an archival background, and we'd like to make use of kind of moving into a linked data platform, also to use new community standards in the archiving world. One is called records and contexts. There's an ontology with it, similar to Premise as well. And our intention really is to be able to model using that ontology. Currently, we're using kind of more XML-based stuff like EAD, serializations, and Premise as well. Some doubling core, some other stuff, but we're really trying. We've created the mapping of these kind of resources into this records in context and Premise-based model. And generally, what we experience now, we are creating a lot of linked data resources based on that model, not only like for a resource for an entire kind of object, but also the idea really was to have a resource for an author, for example, or these kind of things. And what we experience now is Fedora 6, together with the OCFL storage layer beneath it, is creating a huge amount of files and folders if you're using these kind of linked data resources extensively. And just to give you a quick overview of what that means. So basically, I created the simplest possible use case here for the kind of a package that we want to transfer into the repository, just one file. That's kind of our internal mets package here that we create. Metadata, technical, very little descriptive metadata at this point. And if we apply the mapping or the model that we intend to use based on records and context and Premise, this is what we intended to have in Fedora or in a linked data platform. So we would create two main resources, the deposition and the record resource. The deposition more like representing the package as such, and the record resource for the file. And as you can see, both of them, they have some metadata, creator, PID, a title, things like that. And there's a page break, unfortunately. Can I do that? Anyway, it kind of continues. We add kind of Premise events as well as individual resources. Yeah, but as you can see, like for a package with just one file, we're creating more than a dozen linked data resources, which means in in Fedora you'd have like and we create child resources, for example, for the descriptive metadata elements here. So you have a record resource, which is kind of the logical unit, and you have a sub child resource for the identifier or for the title and so on. But they're resources in their own way. And like if you move one step lower to this more storage area, and especially also how Fedora uses OCFL, you can imagine like for all the 15 or 18 resources above, you get an OCFL object, and each OCFL object contains the version file, the inventory with the checksum file, and the first version with the same. And then based on the Fedora implementation or usage of OCFL, you get the triple file. We don't actually use ACLs at the moment, so we can kind of skip those. But you get the NT file and the JSON form, all of the system managed triples. So altogether, if you count all the files and folders, so for a single file storage, you get slightly more than 100 files or folders in the end for all these 15, 20 OCFL objects together. And that's kind of the situation we're experiencing. And I mean, that's manageable to a certain degree with regular infrastructure, but at some point, if we're talking, of millions of objects, in some cases, that will reach its limits. And we've had some indications about that when you in different levels when it comes to indexing, things like that, that at some point you kind of reach the limits. So we're currently really internally reflecting about what we can change. We'd like to keep the data model as such, in the sense of being able, at least on an indexing level, to go with these individual resources. And we're currently following 2 tracks. One is the hash URI thing, meaning that we don't create individual resources for every linked data resource, but we attach many of them, especially the metadata title, for example, as a hash URI rather than an individual resource in Fedora. And the other thing is, if a bit more similar to how we've done that in Fedora 3, you just keep all the metadata in a more or less non-RDF source, and Fedora doesn't really care about the content, even though it's probably going to be linked data RDF, but we're not going to use linked data or Fedora as a linked data platform as such, or in a much reduced way. So that's roughly the situation, and the questions that we currently have is really like how do others model that? I mean, I'm happy to hear different solutions. There's a few detailed questions for that. We started using archival groups also to minimize a bit the number of individual OCFL objects that are created, basically. And there's a little bit two areas where we imagine there might be improvements. One is more the Fedora 6 context with the hash URIs or similar things as mentioned, and the other one is more OCFL related, where where it's also to some degree obvious that it's kind of verbose if we're looking at it from like our perspective. I mean, we understand the standard as such and what the idea behind it is, but if it's used as kind of serialization for single resources, it's quite a bit of overhead. Yeah, so that's I mean, I can show you on, if that's helpful, in a test instance how it's looking. Basically, we have, for example, a record resource, as mentioned. It has child resources, for example, for the title or a PID, which are their own linked data or containers from the point of view of Fedora, with very minimal metadata or minimal content. It's basically just some records in context, properties, defining what type of title it is, where it belongs, like the actual string of the title. But basically, for many metadata elements, that's it. So it's like it's very small resources that we're creating. Yeah, so I'm not
Can
sure
I ask
whether.
I'm going to ask a dumb clarifying question.
Mhm.
So it sounds like you haven't kept the full intellectual object together. And by that, I mean the file that you were trying to preserve is not kept with all of its metadata. Is that what I'm understanding? Because it's now they're all children objects rather than it's all lumped together.
It's actually the
and you can tell
binary.
me, I mean, like, I'm just trying to make sure I understand.
Yeah.
So what is being stored in this object is just like the title of the file, not the title of like the metadata associated with the file, whether that be descriptive and technical. Like, they're not all living together.
Yes, I mean, if you look at the Fedora resources in the current approach, that's correct. Like, we have separate resources for parts of the metadata, and even the descriptive metadata and the technical metadata is a bit separated
Into different
resources,
objects.
which in the background create different OCFL objects as well. Yes.
Well, I mean, and this is just remember, today I am an OCFL editor. I am not to do with Fedora. But that sounds like sort of the opposite of what OCFL intended, right? OCFL intended that you keep all of that together, because if you were to get rid of Fedora, it becomes hard for you to put your content back together. Right? Like, you have your type, like you have some metadata over here, other metadata over here in a different object, the file in a different object, and like, so the act of like pulling everything back together would be cumbersome.
Yes, I mean, we keep it's like the other way around. So we have the actual binary is down here. That's kind of the resource that contains the actual binary. From what we usually have in I'm sure in other institutions as well, we have like the record resource as the logical object, which might have different representations, which in our case are different resources. Currently, we create the archival group here to keep everything below this together in one OCFL object. So like currently, this here is kind of wrapped in one OCFL object.
Is there a reason why you've decided to not place the various RDF properties at the same level as the actual object that you're describing? So is there some reason that you've needed to create the child objects for the D, the RR, and the binary, etc., and then the unit title, PID, etc., beneath those?
Yeah, from in our context, we often have like we often have the situation that we don't even have a binary with it. So we often have resources, record resources, that are more representing not a specific binary or multiple binaries, but could be more a kind of an archival. It could be a series.
So within the archival structure, your fonts and your series, etc.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
And the idea beneath it, yes, I mean, you might have the situation where you have like one representation which consists of multiple binaries, and all of them, those would be part of kind of this resource. But I think our assumption really was to create the resources. And I'm talking more from the linked data perspective. The resources, for example, for an agent, or for a person, or for a place, or as individual resources that you might be using from other kind of independent of a specific record resource or an instantiation. So like it's kind of this modeling that brought us to this structure.
Maybe if I understood you correctly, or your question correctly, then it was also related to why do you have the unit title as a separate resource. Part of it is that at least some of them have like, it's not just a literal value that you need to store, but also like the type of identifier or the type of title. So you have several properties, one describing more the relation and one the actual value or literal value of the title. And we knew Fedora doesn't support blank notes, or does very has limited support for blank notes. And we actually weren't sure about the hashed URIs. It now turns out that would have been an option to keep them more closer together. I don't think, Andreas, correct me if I'm wrong, but that we have a specific need to like, we need to version the title explicitly on its own as a separate resource or reference that. Yeah. And I see Andreas Woods would like to say something.
Sure, thanks. So then there's a little bit of chatter going on in the chat. Maybe just a point of clarification. When you use Fedora archival groups and you have sub objects within that archival group, if you look at the file system and what's in OCFL, all of those objects are within that single directory hierarchy, correct? Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that Rosalind speaks to your point on objects being kind of dispersed across the file system. Yeah, maybe just sort of separately, it seems like if the issue is a proliferation of files effectively, and the impact of that, it seems like the hash URIs, it'd be interesting to see what that would look like if some of these children resources turned into hash URIs. The other thing that comes to mind is kind of a separation of concerns, which I think speaks to Andreas, what you were saying about the possibility of using kind of like the Fedora 3 model, where these are non-RDF sources, and there's a layer above Fedora that makes sense of the RDF and does the indexing, and that Fedora is just effectively storing non-RDF sources. Like, so the hash URIs and maybe using linked data or implementing your linked data at a level above Fedora. It seems like potential avenues for exploration.
I would just say, this is Josh from University of Maryland. Hash URIs is the way we've gone. I know it's not, if you think about it in an old school kind of database normalization mode, it's not, you don't want to repeat that information on a bunch of different resources, which you end up doing with hash URIs. But I think the trade-offs are worth it, that you're able to simplify the number of resources that you have to create in the repository and just keep things a little cleaner at that level. And then, using things like OWL same as makes it possible to expose that information in a more globally useful way. So,
Scott, you had your hand up there.
Yeah, I was just going to echo what Andrew and Rosalind were saying, that our approach has been to keep the amount of linked data to a minimum, just what we need mainly for kind of repository management, and then storing a lot of the metadata, like the descriptive metadata or the premise metadata, just in XML documents, non-RDF resources. And then having something like Andrew was suggesting outside and above, like a Solar index or something that would be used to query that. And then you can keep your OCFL objects kind of nice and tight.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just a bit curious there about, like, if we like from the outset, looking at Fedora 6 or earlier as well. I mean, if it's supposed to be a linked data platform, it feels a bit contrary to trying to have as little resources as possible, and kind of moving all these metadata things into non-RDF sources and then deal with it outside of Fedora. But I mean, at least that's our conclusion now. Also a bit that it's currently it's not feasible to go with kind of these detailed resources in Fedora as this kind of the repository and storage platform.
So yeah, what I took from Rosalind's note is that's, for me, that would be a good starting point to think again what should be together in the OCFL object. Like, descriptive metadata, does it need to be in there, or is there a good reason to keep it separate? There could be, I don't know. I mean, we have to think about it, but to take that as a leading idea when we think about how we want to restructure things. And the other thing is, well, think of Fedora more as a storage layer where you keep that amount of linked data accessible that's needed to manage your storage layer, but not like the whole linked data that you might want to have to display it or to import it into an archival management system or something like that. I mean, you can still store that data in Fedora as non-RDF sources, but maybe you don't need it as actual RDF within Fedora accessible. That's a bit the two approaches I would now take away from our meeting for now. We have to see what we come up with in the end to
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, Emily Porter just put something in the chat, and one of the things like Emily, who works at my team, has said is like, when do you actually need that RDF? Are you trying to expose the RDF so that it can be used like on the internets, right? Like it's supposed to be, or are you trying to preserve the RDF? And if you think about sort of that long-term sustainability, or even the intention of linked data, is that necessary? Are you storing it one way and then exposing it via linked data? Because there's all kinds of ways to model things, right? But like, I think there's where is the concern for the different layers of the system? You know, down at the bottom, you're really concerned with how quickly things happen, and you know how much you want to store, right? Like from a cost perspective for storing, how quickly things happen, from how easily the application uses. And then when you get up to the top level, that's where linked data becomes really useful, not so much down at the very bottom. And I will also say Fedora or Hyrax and Fedora 4, Hyrax made some decisions to continue to use Fedora as its metadata editor. And there's some thoughts on whether or not that is the right way to go about things. I'm sure you can gather what mine are, but.
I just want to get to Scott's question there.
Yeah, so kind of to follow up on what Rosalind was just saying, that looking at the kind of linked data resources as separate objects, I'm thinking about long-term preservation and future me or people who come after me, that the part of the way we've approached our Fedora and OCFL repositories is we want them to be somewhat intelligible and usable in the future to others. And so that's part of the reason why we try to keep it simple and put a lot of our metadata into just XML files, non-RDF resources. And then there was a long discussion several weeks ago on the Code for Lib list about the tension between search and discovery and preservation. And the way, by the way, I should introduce myself. I'm Scott Prater. I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The way that we've approached Fedora 6 in our repository is focusing mostly on the long-term preservation aspect of it and using other tools for search and discovery that are kind of bolted onto the side. I mean, that's the approach we've taken with it, which has helped us in making our object models somewhat simple, even though, as you said, Andreas, it means that we don't have the full richness of all the linked data there at our fingertips. It's a trade-off that we're okay with.
Hi, this is Calvin, from the National Libraries of Medicine. Just want to comment that we also had the I know issue back in the day. I think that's just how OCFL's file structure is, and we have like a lot of records, and we don't use RDF, so everything is stored within a single object. But we recently just migrated it like 3.7 million Akruba types from Fedora 3 to 6, and that took a lot of inodes. So before we did this, we had to like increase our amount. So we threw like 500 millions of inodes with 2 terabytes of space for, I guess, the dev and QA environment that we plan to use. And so far that has held up. But yeah, we also had a Fedora dev team to like develop like the head versions only when you do the migration. So that will only store the latest version of the object versions. So that has slimmed down a little bit. But yeah, I think I know it's just what you buy in with the OCFL, especially when you have a lot of records.
Just a quick question. I haven't been following like actively the OCFL discussions. But is there a discussion going on about the number of files or the efficiency of its structure, or is that something more specific, how especially also how Fedora uses it?
If you scroll down to that object example, so the files that are specific to OCFL in this example are the namaste file, which is that first one, then the inventory.json file, which is the current inventory file, and then the SHA-512. The reason the inventory file then gets put in the version 1 is because is so that you can recreate version 1 if you need to, and just compare the inventory, the current inventory to the old inventory. And that just sort of, if something went haywire, you have that old inventory to take a look at. But that's it. Those are all the files that are related to OCFL. So that's part of the reason I was asking the question about if I'm understanding the object model correctly. It's that all we're creating an object for every single one of those child objects in Fedora, rather than saying all of this should be pulled together. I mean, if you did that, you put it all together, you would have one OCFL object. You might, I don't know how many files you would have, because I don't know what that would look like. But I would say, that inventory.json file changes, but each version of an object you're creating, you're only actually adding 2 OCFL files for each version. So
yeah, I mean, that's kind of our like strategy now to see like what are the ways to actually reduce the number of OCFL files and trying to make them a bit bigger. And I think both the so using hash URIs certainly helps and puts like all these kind of sub resources into the parent resource, so they're not OCFL objects on their own.
Right.
And another thing was to kind of create the archival group not on the kind of this representation level, but for the entire record resource, which also kind of again reduces the number of OCFL objects we create in general. But I mean, we we currently would rather prefer not to have to move, like if you imagine more complex packages that are being stored, we'd rather continue dealing with the individual items and linking them logically rather than having them all in one big OCFL. That will be a kind of a larger change at some point if we decide, okay, let's have like multiple record resources in that sense in the same container and OCFL object.
So just so like for language sake, because I think what's being conflated is the object model with OCFL. There's only 2 files that you're creating for OCFL. So you can't really get rid of, and you can't get rid of those files. That's the inventory files, like the inventory.json and then the hash of it, right, to know that it's right. So there's not really, I think there's an option to not store those in each version. Am I remembering that? I'm looking at Andrew and Danfield. I think that's an option in at some point. If I'm anyway,
what is the option you're questioning?
Like, not if you can you scroll down to the OCFL object? Doesn't Fedora allow you to say you're not going to store the inventory.json in the version?
At the top level is the optimization.
Top level always exists, but underneath version 1,
that's required by the spec.
right? But I'm thinking of the
Mutable head.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Jared. Appreciate it. Yeah, so I mean, by implementing mutable head, that's the only way you're going to get rid of the OCFL files. So I just want to be clear that there are not a lot of OCFL files. There are a lot of, that Fedora is creating a lot of OCFL objects.
Yep.
Andrew? Oh, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
No, go ahead, Andrew. Yeah, please.
So maybe just circling back, Andreas, to the question you had around scale and performance. So we use OCFL not in the context of Fedora. We have something like 200 million objects, and we used to have it on a POSIX file system. Now it's all behind S3, and like scale is not an issue at the persistence layer for us. And it seems like the same could be true in the Fedora context, where as long as there's a separation between, and I'm just echoing some points that have been made here already on the call, separating preservation, which Fedora and OCFL does a fantastic job at, from access, and so we're constantly on updates and on creation of objects. We have a number of indices, and then all of our delivery comes out of those indexes, and so and the Fedora API is positioned for this as well, with notifications. So anything that's happening within the repository, you have notifications coming out, which could then activate populating and updating indexes. But then performance becomes an issue when you're also in. I will fully acknowledge, like the Fedora API is tempting you to use it as a delivery API as well. It's very compelling. But if you resist that temptation, it seems like having delivery being a completely different sensibility. It's how at scale we've been able to address any performance concerns.
Yeah, if just a follow-up question, if you're talking about 200 million objects, You mean OCFL objects? Or
I mean, OCFL objects.
yeah, all right.
Any other questions or comments? I know there's some stuff in the chat here about the inode issues or the inode concern that was brought up before. So
Yeah, I'll have to go through that afterwards. I haven't been able to follow it all at the same time. So
I'll save the chat and I can send it to you, Andreas, so that you can
perfect.
have that to go back through.
Okay. Yes, okay. Well, thanks. I guess if there's no other mentioning, I think we've been able to discuss the questions, and I think the way forward for us is or has to go into the direction of not doing like too detailed stuff that we rather do on the kind of public access side, and not do that in the repository for preservation. And we'll follow up on whether it's more the hash URI type of thing or the solution that goes into, you know, just putting non-RDF sources into the repository. That's what we're currently following up on, and we'll see how that goes. Good. It's good to hear that you have such a number of OCFL objects working properly, Andrew. That's helpful. Yeah.
All right. Well, hopefully this was helpful for not just Thomas and Andreas there, but for others who were interested in the conversation. Thank you to everybody that did come and contributed. So I'll save the chat, and I'm going to save the recording, obviously, and then if anybody has any follow-up questions, we can either regroup here or we can bring it to a tech meeting on Thursdays at 11 Eastern. So
Very well.
Awesome.
Thanks, Aaron,
Thank
for
you.
arranging.
Thank you
Thanks
very
for
much.
arranging
Yes.
this.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
The
no
discussion's
problem.
always clarifying, so thank you.
Bye bye.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Bye.